Last week I built my brand new 2024 inspired Hex. It's not all sunshine and rainbows though. The first ride I had on this bike didn't quite go so well. The short story is I came a cropper, got myself a decent black eye and more seriously a really deep gash in my knee. It was actually so deep I cut my tendon or ligament, I forget which. So I've got stitches in my knee. The doctors have told me to keep off the bike for a little bit, so unfortunately no riding today. Instead, I'm going to do a video I've wanted to do for a little while, and that is 5 things I love and hate about my 3 main bikes. As much as I absolutely love these bikes, there's going to be some things I love more, and there's going to be some things well, hate's a strong word, but there's going to be some things I don't like quite so much. So let's just dive straight in. Let's start with the newest bike. Even if I only had this a few days at the time of recording, I've ridden the Hex model for years, and in no particular order, here's 5 things I love about it. 1. Bigger wheels. The Hex is Inspired's only 26-inch model. It's far more common to see street trials being ridden with smaller 24-inch wheels. I think that's down to Inspired's first model being 24-inch and being made popular by Danny McCaskill riding it, rather than 24-inch wheels being the absolute best size. I started riding trials on 26-inch wheels way back in 1997, and other than a few years riding 24-inch myself, I came to realise I prefer the bigger wheels I started with. I feel the bigger wheels have a few advantages. Firstly, it makes the bike better at riding natural, as it rolls over rough ground nicer. I also find it works better for static trials moves, such as gaps, taps, side ops and hooks. I'm not exactly sure why, but it definitely feels more capable of the bigger moves. The downside is, it's not quite as nimble as a 24-inch, but it's extremely close, and worth it for the advantages I just mentioned. 2. Frame quality. Inspired is the name in street trials that all other brands try to emulate. They weren't the first street trials frames out there, but they set the standard with quality that I'm yet to see rivaled. Because they've been around for a while, they've had plenty of time to hone the details. They were one of the first brands to use tapered steers and through axles, and they have very well designed brake mounts and yokes. Dave, who owns Inspired, is a perfectionist, almost to a fault, and insists on only the best quality. You'll see this in the preface BB shell and brake mounts, but also in the paint job, which is always exceptional. 3. Tensioner. I'm going to lick my own boots now, as this tensioner is something I made and I'm particularly proud of. If you've seen my Hex builds, you'll have seen it before, as I've transferred it from bike to bike over the years since I made it. It's slightly crude, as it was cut from a sheet of titanium by hand on my kitchen table, and if you've ever tried to cut titanium, you know that's no small feat, then reluctantly bent to shape. The slider is some thermo-moldable plastic that is essentially nylon, and there's no noticeable drag. It mounts neatly to Inspired tensioner mount and is nicely tucked out of the way. The end result is good tension whilst being light, difficult to hit, and hard to break if I do manage to hit it. Perfect. 4. Bash guard. This might not be an obvious one for this list, but it's one of my favourite updates to an item that's not often given much thought. Before Inspired made this chainring and bash combo, most of us street riders were using 4-bolt cranks, which forced us to use a bash guard that was bigger than it needed to be. Street trials bikes have lower bottom brackets than comp trials bikes, so ground clearance can be limited. Using a bigger bash reduced the clearance even more. 22-tooth chainrings are the most common size for the front of a street trials bike, and now that crank manufacturers are back using removable spiders, Inspired combined the chainring, spider and bash guard into one item, which let them make the outer circumference only as big as it needs to be, plus saving weight at the same time. It also looks really cool, which is a bonus. 5. Looks. Speaking of looking cool, I think the Inspired Hex is the best looking street trials bike available, and I think this latest build of mine is one of the nicest bikes I've ever built. Looks aren't important to some people, but I think it is. There's nothing worse than walking up to your bike and not being fully stoked on it. You're already on a downer before you take your first pedal. By having a bike you can't take your eyes off, you're just starting the ride already hyped. Things I hate. 1. Compromises. I don't narrow myself to only being known as a street trials rider. I'm simply a trials rider. That said, this bike is definitely designed and spec'd to suit street at the compromise of off-road ability. Which is a shame, because I love riding rocks and logs as much as I love riding street, and the compromises make that bit of a struggle. The lower bottom bracket makes ground clearance and rear wheel control worse, the short wheelbase makes power moves cramped and limited, and the steep head angle can feel sketchy sending big gaps to front wheel. It just so happens those factors make it really nice to bunny hop, spin and manual on the streets, so I choose that as priority. Two, exposed rotors. Disc brakes are amazing for street. They have high power, can be modulated and are nice and quiet. The downside is that they're exposed and can easily be bent if hit, especially with the bigger 203mm size. I sometimes avoid doing certain moves like riding skinnies because I don't want to end my ride and have a long walk carrying my bike due to slipping and landing on a rotor. Even if it's not catastrophic, a small bend can lead to an annoying rubbing or noisy brake, and that drives me mad. Three, harsh ride. The small aluminium frame and fork combined with harder PSI tyres and a stiff bar leads to a pretty harsh feeling bike. There's definitely times I've wished for a short travel fork to take the sting out of landings. My Hex isn't as harsh as these bikes can get though. I remember trying Danny McCaskill's Sky with his even smaller frame and overbuilt fork plus his 60 PSI tyres and feeling exhausted after only a couple of minutes. Maybe the 26-inch wheels help and is another reason why I love them. 4. No nice stems. Don't get me wrong, the Tratec stem does the job well, but you have to admit it's slightly bland. Unfortunately, street trials generally use an odd-sized 90mm by 35° rise stem to help raise the front end. This unusual size just isn't one you'll find from the main brands. Shame really, as BMXers and mountain bikers get a nice choice of CNC designs when we're kind of just limited to one. 5. Disc adapters. I don't have to run adapters with this bike. Actually, my last bike was sans adapters. That's because Inspired have plus 20mm post mounts, which means the smallest rotors you can use are 180mm. I loved how the bike looked with no adapters, and I generally found the 180mm to be powerful enough. Then again, there's not really any such thing as too much power, so for this build, I upsized to 203mm. The downside was that I needed to use adapters, which don't look as neat as no adapters. Also, I had to find a random plus 21.5mm model. There's plenty of adapters to take the standard 160 mount to a 203, but not so many for 180 to 203. If you need one for yourself, then hope to the H adapter, which works nicely. Well, that's the Hex done. Let's swap to something bigger. My Pivot Shadowcat trail bike, and 5 things I love about it. 1. Wheel size. Like the Hex, I'm starting with the wheel size first. This is Pivot's 27.5-inch wheel trail bike, and it seems it's getting rarer and rarer to see brands still making models with this smaller size, which is a shame. I recently had a comment get a ton of upvotes on Pinkbike as I reminded people that going as fast as possible isn't the only way to have fun on a bike, and brands swapping all models to 29-inch wheels and slacker geometry makes playful riding harder. Playing and jibbing is what this bike is great for, and the smaller wheels help with that. Plus, it's also a fantastic option for smaller riders who catch themselves on bigger wheels. 2. Quality and weight. There's no denying that pivots aren't cheap, but you are paying for an extremely high quality frame, which was honestly a little surprising how light it was when I first held it. I was also impressed with the details this frame has too. There's obviously been a lot of thought gone into it, such as the rubber protection inside the rear triangle. They must hate noisy bikes as much as I do. There's also a drainage hole below the shock to avoid water pooling up, more mounting points than you can shake a stick at, and a decent down tube protector for shrugging off those rock strikes. I could go on, and please check out my bike build link below for a full breakdown, but it's safe to say that this frame is well up there as one of the better quality frames you can get. 3. Frame size. Sticking with the frame, I love how low slung it is. Being a trials rider, I'm used to small frames, and having a lower top tube really does help with clearing your legs in wild tricks. Also, importantly, it's well out of the way when needing to bail too. 4. Big dropper post. I generally downsize my bikes. I'm just shy of 6 foot, 177 centimeters, and I ride a size medium when a large might be a more usual choice. And my 200mm travel Wolftooth model means I can get the saddle nice and high for trail riding, but dropped super low when things get rowdy. What a time to be alive. 5. Great brakes. I could have added this subject to any of my bike's loves, but the Hayes brakes are awesome. I've sung their praises in many videos, so I won't go on too much about them here, but the key points for me are the ease of setup and bleeding, the power, the modulation, the light lever action that helps reduce arm pump, but also the strength of the lever that doesn't snap off from simply pulling it like some other brands do. These things can shrug off a crash or two. Oh. Things I hate. 1. Exposed mech. Similar to a disc rotor, I get the fear of doing certain moves just in case I end up landing on the mech and wrecking it. Only, unlike a rotor, these cost nearly £200 to replace. Maybe I'm more paranoid than I need to be, as I'm yet to break or bend this XTR one. But I have plenty of memories smashing mechs to bits from my years of trials riding. Unfortunately, things like gearboxes don't have the engagement points I require, so I'm stuck with mechs for now. Perhaps the latest SRAM direct mount style might give me a little bit more confidence. 2. Ground clearance. Bottom brackets seem to have got lower over the years, and I can't deny that it does help make a bike feel planted and calmer. But sadly, low ground clearance is the enemy of trials riding, especially when combined with a bigger chainring. To try and combat this, I fitted a smaller 28 tooth ring with built-in bash guard. This gives me a little more clearance over a more usual bigger ring, and also keeps my chain protected for when I inevitably do hit it. I wouldn't really want a higher bottom bracket though, as I still use this bike for normal trail riding and I wouldn't want to compromise it too much for its intended purpose. 3. Compromises. As just mentioned, the low BB is a compromise, but then again, so is much of this bike. There's a reason why trials bikes don't use suspension. It's heavier, saps energy, and alters the geometry. For me to make this bike good for trials and jibbing, I have to run the suspension a lot firmer and less damped than I would for trail use. I also pump the tyres up pretty hard too. This means I can't easily swap from one type of riding to the other when out and about. I'd need to take a shock and tyre pump at the least, plus a few minutes to do the adjustments. I did try to ride a local trail in its firmer setting and it wasn't much fun. I'd love it if I could seamlessly ride a trail, then spot some rocks and just go ride them as well as I can in jibbing mode, but sadly that's not the case and I have to choose a compromise one way or the other. Oh my god. 4. Lots of cables. Not really the end of the world, especially as I've made my cables long enough to allow me to do a full rotation in case I suddenly learn how to bar spin, but I would love this to be neater. I guess it would be possible to have wireless shifting on a dropper, but then I would have batteries to charge, and I love that this bike doesn't need anything like that. 5. Sharp saddle. Another compromise. This saddle's designed for trail riding, so hasn't had as much thought put into making it as good for jibbing. As such, it's longer and narrower with sharper edges than you'd find on a dirt jump saddle. It's comfy for longer rides, which is why I don't swap it, but for some trials moves, I sometimes end up with bruises on the inside of my thighs, which isn't fun. That's a Shadowcat done. Let's go even bigger with my Pivot Shuttle LT e-bike and 5 things I love about it. 1. Power. This is Pivot's biggest e-bike model and it has a huge 756 watt battery and Shimano's powerful EP8 motor giving 85 Nm of torque. I like knowing that if I need it, this thing will pedal up anything as long as I have grip, and I'm yet to run out of battery mid-ride. 2. Suspension. I'm running Fox suspension, 170mm travel, 38 fork and Float X shock giving 160mm travel out back. Either these products are really good, the linkage is well designed, or the extra weight of the bike helps it track the ground, or maybe all of the above. But I've been well impressed with the bike's ability to tame natural trails as well as some bigger hits. I'm no suspension geek as I'm used to rigid bikes, so don't take my word as gospel, but I've never been left asking for more. 3. Cranks. Short cranks just make sense on an e-bike. You don't lose out on power because you have the motor for assistance, but you gain a ton of ground clearance, which is very much appreciated on rocky climbs where I need to keep pedaling. These 145mm pin cranks feel a bit odd at first, but soon becomes natural, but it's laughable what you're able to pedal through. 4. Big wheels. This bike has 29-inch wheels and is my first experience with this size. Coming from smaller wheels, I had concerns that such big hoops would just nerf any jibbing abilities, but I've been pleasantly surprised. Of course, the bigger wheels are great down rough trails too. Overall, I can see why bigger wheels are popular, I did notice a smoother ride, although that could be the suspension. Either way, the big wheels get a love, as I forgot about the size as soon as I dropped into my first trail. Coming from smaller wheels, I thought I'd hate them, but forgetting about the size just proves that they were working well. 5. Gears. I didn't plan on doing many skinnies on this bike, so I didn't have too many concerns about my trials riding being damaging to my gears, but I had been told that e-bikes are particularly tough on them due to the torque. There's also the weight of the bike, which would be quite damaging if it fell onto the right hand side. But so far it's been faultless. I've maybe not ridden the bike as much as others I own, but it's been thrashed when I have, including a few crashes. I'm yet to have any shifting index issues, and the lever is as light as the day it was installed, despite some wet and muddy rides. I'm honestly surprised and impressed. Things I hate. 1. Weight. There's no getting around it, this is a full fat, full weight e-bike. The carbon frame does try to bring it down slightly, but 24 kilos is still a lot of bike. I'd love to say you don't notice it while riding, but you kinda do. More so on the downs than the ups though. Actually, uphill with the assistance, it feels very lightweight. A normal bike feels like you're dragging an anchor after riding one of these, but if you're like me, with an active riding style, looking to hop and jump off every route and bump, then the extra weight does make the bike feel more glued to the ground. It's also a handful when trying to bail and keep hold of it so it doesn't slam down. You do get used to how it rides though, so for me, the weight is mostly noticed when off the bike, trying to move it around. Getting it onto a roof rack would be interesting. So simply because it's hard to lift onto racks, hooks and stands, it gets a hate from me. 2. Motor delay. I'm not sure if this annoys other people or even if every motor has it, but the Shimano motor has maybe half a second delay in giving assistance and stop giving it. This means jibbing can be tricky as I'm used to precision timing with my pedal kicks, and that slight delay throws my timing out the window. Again, it's something you can get used to, especially if it's a bike you ride the most, but it does make swapping from a normal bike to this a little bit of a learning curve. 3. Ground clearance. Similar deal to my Shadowcat, a lower BB reduces clearance for trialsy stuff. Only this time there's an added motor that sticks out further than the chainring. Fortunately, Pivot fully surround the motor and cover it in some thick rubber protection to avoid it getting damaged. Handy, as I have landed on it a couple of times. This isn't really anything normal riders might notice, but for trials and jibs, it can make things a little harder. 4. Cables. I complained that the Shadowcat had a lot of cables, but this has the same number and then a couple more for the motor control console, so it's not like I could even remove them all with a wireless shifter in post. It's not caused me any issues and I don't plan bar spinning or tail whipping this bike, but I would like it if it was a little bit tidier. 5. Cable routing. Sticking with cables, let's add internal routing to this list. I admit I like the neater end results, and Pivot do have a decent system, but it's still a bit of a faff. The Shuttle LT with the battery removed has a nice access point which helps though, and I'm also really glad this doesn't have headset or stem routing either. Perhaps I should swap this for a love instead of a hate. So there we go, that is 5 things I love and hate about these bikes. Do you agree? Do you have the same feelings towards bikes you have? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Fingers crossed I can get out riding again soon. The days are getting longer, a little bit drier, and I am absolutely itching to ride this bike. Like I mentioned, I think this is the best looking Inspired I've ever had, and it just makes me stoked to ride it. But until then, give me a like, give me a thumbs up, give me a subscribe if you haven't already, and I will catch you next time where, fingers crossed, I'll be giving this bike some good testing. So take care everyone, have an amazing week, see you later.